What if I told you that every single problem you think you have is actually about other people?
It sounds kind of wild, right?
Totally. Or maybe even weirder. What if you actually chose to dislike yourself?
Yeah, these are the kinds of really counterintuitive ideas we're unpacking today. It's a conversation, really, between a young man who's searching for answers and a philosopher steeped in Adlerian psychology. And prepare yourself, because the philosopher makes some pretty bold claims right off the bat.
The philosopher kicks things off with a statement that, honestly, it makes you pause. All problems are interpersonal relationship problems.
Sounds pretty extreme, doesn't it?
It really does.
But the logic, when you break it down, is, well, quite simple. Think about loneliness. You literally can't feel lonely unless other people exist.
Okay.
If you were genuinely the only being in the universe, problems, as we know them, would sort of vanish. Adler himself apparently said something like, to get rid of one's problems, all one can do is live in the universe all alone.
And the young man in the dialogue, he pushes back immediately, which feels right. You know, he's like, wait, what about my own worries, my anxieties?
Yeah, or the big philosophical questions like happiness or the meaning of life. They feel so internal, right?
Yeah.
Not just about other people. But this is where the philosopher's argument gets really interesting. Even those very internal seeming worries, they still carry the shadows of other people.
Shadows of other people, how so?
The philosopher bring up the idea that value itself, what we consider important or worthwhile, is fundamentally social.
Oh, right, like the example they use with the diamond or the dollar bill.
Exactly that. A dollar bill, objectively, it's just paper. It only has value because we as a society agree it does. If you were stranded alone, that dollar bill is useless. It has no social context, therefore no value.
So even the things we worry about internally, like our own worth or achieving something valuable, that sense of value often comes from how we measure up or connect within that social web.
Precisely. If you remove the interpersonal relationships, the foundation for many of those problems disappears. It all ties back.
Which leads us neatly into the young man's big personal issue. This really intense self-dislike. He's just laser focused on his shortcomings. I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling.
Oh, absolutely. And the philosopher's response here as well is pretty provocative. They don't just say he dislikes himself. They say he is resolved not to like himself.
Resolved, like decided.
Yeah. And that this state of not liking himself is actually serving as a kind of virtue. It has a purpose for him.
Okay, wait. A virtue. Choosing self-dislike. That sounds completely backwards. Why would anyone do that?
The purpose, according to this viewpoint, is protection. It's a strategy, essentially, to avoid being disliked by others, to avoid getting hurt in relationships.
How does that work?
Well, if you're already convinced of your own flaws, if you've already decided you're not likable, then if someone does reject you or criticize you.
You have a ready-made explanation. Well, of course it's because of my flaws.
Exactly. It shields you from the potentially deeper pain of being rejected for just being you. It's like a preemptive defense mechanism against interpersonal hurt. You avoid putting your real self out there.
So it's a way to dodge the risk involved in genuine connection.
Building a wall, maybe? Using your flaws as the bricks?
The philosopher used that story, that anecdote about the student with the blushing problem to illustrate this.
Her stated issue was, I blush all the time, and it stops me confessing my feelings to this person I like. I need to fix the blushing.
Which sounds logical. Blushing is the obstacle, cause and effect.
But the Adlerian perspective flips it. It looks for the purpose. And the argument is her purpose was actually to need the symptom. The blushing wasn't the real barrier, it was the convenient excuse.
An excuse?
Yeah, it let her avoid the much scarier possibility, confessing her feelings and facing potential rejection directly. As long as she had the blushing problem, she could always tell herself, oh, if only I didn't blush, things could have worked out. It's like insurance against failure.
Wow. Okay, so the young man's self-dislike, it's like her blushing. It's the symptom he's focused on, but its purpose is to protect him from potentially getting hurt in relationships.
That's the parallel they draw. It keeps him from having to take the risk, from stepping forward and potentially being disliked or rejected for who he actually is.
Let's dig into a specific kind of self-dislike. Adler is known for these feelings of inferiority.
Yes. It's basically that feeling of having less worth, a subjective judgment you make about yourself, almost always through comparison.
And the young man describes himself as just a huge blob of these feelings. constantly comparing himself.
The philosopher uses their own height as a simple example, being, was it 61 inches tall? That's just a fact, a number.
Right.
The feeling of inferiority only arose when they assigned a negative meaning to that number in comparison to others. They felt short. But then a friend helped them reframe it, see it as an advantage, making people feel more relaxed.
Okay, so it wasn't the height itself, it was the subjective meaning, the interpretation, based on comparing.
That is the absolute crucial takeaway here. Feelings of inferiority. They aren't objective facts about the world, they are subjective interpretations. Like that well water example, again, 60 degrees isn't objectively good or bad, it's about how you feel about it in context.
And the power there is, if it's subjective.
And you can change it. You have the power to change the interpretation, change the value you assign. That's the lever for change.
Okay, but then the philosopher makes a really important distinction between just having a feeling of inferiority and having an inferiority complex. The feeling itself isn't necessarily bad.
Not at all. In fact, that feeling, I'm not quite there yet, I want to improve, I could do better, that's seen as the very engine of growth and striving. Adler called it the pursuit of superiority.
Pursuit of superiority. That sounds like competition again.
We'll get to that, but here it means striving to be better than your past self, not necessarily better than others. Think of a chef who's always tweaking recipes, trying to improve their craft. That's healthy striving, often fueled by a feeling of, this could be better.
Okay, so acknowledging imperfection to fuel growth is good.
Right. The complex happens when you start using that feeling of inferiority as an excuse.
An excuse. How does that look in practice?
It tends to follow this kind of logic.
Yeah.
Because A is true, my situation, my perceived flaw. B, something I want or need to do, is impossible. Like, I didn't get into that top school, A, so I can't succeed in this field. B, the philosopher says this cause and effect is only apparent. It's not necessarily real.
And looking at it teleologically purpose-driven, it's not really, I can't do B because of A. It's more like,
I don't want to do B. Or rather, I don't want to face the effort, the risk, the potential failure involved in trying to do B. It's often easier, less scary, to just point to limitation A and say, see, I can't.
it justifies inaction. Keeps you safe, in a way.
Exactly. Then it avoids challenging situations.
And what about that other pattern, the if-only pattern? If only I were taller, smarter, richer, then I could be really successful.
Yeah, that protects the ego beautifully. It lets you maintain this idea that you have massive untapped potential, held back only by this one specific thing. You never have to actually test that potential and risk finding out maybe you weren't going to be that successful anyway.
This is definitely challenging, putting the responsibility firmly back on the individual's choices and interpretations.
It is. It can feel uncomfortable, but there's also kind of liberation in it, potentially.
Now, flipping the coin, they talk about braggarts, people who boast constantly. The idea is they also often have feelings of inferiority, and this connects to the superiority complex.
Right. A superiority complex is basically the other side of the inferiority complex coin. Someone feels deeply inferior inside, but they lack the courage to strive in a healthy way. So they compensate. They act as if they're superior.
It's a front, a fabricated feeling of superiority, as they put it.
Exactly. It's a shortcut to feeling important without doing the actual work of self-improvement.
And the examples they give, like giving authority, name-dropping famous people, constantly showing off expensive brands.
You're trying to borrow importance. You make yourself look better by associating with things or people society deems high status. It's not about your own inherent worth. It's about latching onto external validation because deep down, you don't feel you have enough of your own. That insecurity, that feeling of inferiority is driving it.
And even boasting about things you actually did achieve, can that still stem from insecurity?
According to Adler, yes. He apparently said, the one who boasts does so only out of a feeling of inferiority. Think about it. If you have genuine, quiet confidence in yourself and your abilities, do you feel a constant need to announce them to everyone?
Probably not. You just are.
Right. Boasting is like shouting your superiority because you're secretly terrified people won't accept or notice you otherwise. It's an inverted expression of that inferiority feeling.
So these two complexes, inferiority and superiority, they're not really opposites. They're like neighbors, fed by the same root.
They absolutely border each other,
Yeah.
very closely linked. And the philosopher brings up a particularly complex and maybe dark example of this, bragging about misfortune.
Bragging about how bad things are for you. Oh, you think you've got problems? Let me tell you.
Exactly that kind of thing. The underlying purpose there, from this perspective, is to make yourself feel special, unique in your suffering.
Special through suffering.
Yeah. It's a way to place yourself above others. You couldn't possibly understand my pain. And crucially, it can be a tool for control. By constantly highlighting your victimhood or suffering, you can make others feel guilty, obligated, worried about you. You can subtly, or not so subtly, restrict their actions and demand their attention.
Wow, that's quite a perspective, using weakness as a form of power.
Adler's quote on this is potent. In our culture, weakness can be quite strong and powerful. The classic example is the baby completely helpless, yet it can command the entire household through its weakness.
But the downside is, if your specialness or power comes from your misfortune,
And you need that misfortune. You become invested in maintaining it to keep that identity and that control. It's a trap.
Okay, this is all shaking up some common assumptions. Let's tackle another really big one. The idea that life is not a competition. This feels so counter to how many of us are raised or how society often operates.
It's definitely a major stumbling block, both for the young man and, I think, for many of us. The philosopher insists that the pursuit of superiority we talked about, it's not about climbing a ladder and pushing others down. It's about moving forward yourself on what they call a flat playing field. Imagine everyone on the same level ground, and you're just focused on taking your own next step forward from where you were yesterday. There's no vertical axis, no ranking against others.
Just focus on your own progress, your own journey. Stop looking side to side. Stop comparing.
Exactly, and the philosophers bring in that core Adlerian principle. We are not the same, but we are equal. We have differences, age, skills, knowledge, whatever. But those differences don't equate to differences in fundamental human worth. Treat everyone as an equal human being.
Okay, but what happens if we don't adopt that view? If we do see life as a competition, what are the downsides?
Well, if life is fundamentally a competition in your eyes, the philosopher argues, quote, it is inevitable that feelings of inferiority will arise. You're constantly measuring, did I win this interaction? Did I lose? Am I ahead? Am I behind? Complexes just naturally grow out of that constant comparison.
And, maybe even more significantly, how does it change how we see other people?
It transforms them. They stop being potential comrades, potential collaborators, potential friends.
Doesn't become rivals, enemies.
Exactly. The philosopher warns, quite starkly, before you know it, you start to see each and every person, everyone in the whole world, as your enemy.
And if the world is full of enemies,
It becomes a scary, threatening place. You can't trust anyone. Even when you win something, there's no real peace because you're just waiting for the next challenge, the next person trying to take your spot. It sounds exhausting.
it does. They use that little anecdote, the teenager obsessed with how they look.
Right, and the grandmother saying, very simply, you're the only one who's worried how you look. It highlights how often that intense feeling of being judged, of being in competition, is something we project onto the world. Others are often just living their own lives.
So what's the alternative propose if you let go of competition?
Others can become comrades, fellow travelers on this flat playing field. You can genuinely feel happy for their successes, you can offer support, you can contribute to their well-being without feeling threatened.
And that shift, seeing people as comrades instead of enemies.
It fundamentally changes your entire experience. The world starts to feel like a safer, more pleasant place. And guess what? Interpersonal relationship problems drastically decrease.
It all circles back. Now, the young man, he keeps returning to his past, right? His difficult childhood, feeling like he's shaped by external forces. But the philosopher consistently redirects him.
Back to teleology, back to purpose. It's always about the meaning you are making and the goal you are pursuing right now, regardless of the past.
And this comes up strongly when they discuss anger.
Yes, they make a distinction. There might be, say, righteous indignation about social injustice, which is impersonal, or personal anger, the kind you feel in an argument. They see that primarily as a tool.
A tool. A tool for what?
Control, a means to make the other person submit, to yield to your demands or viewpoint quickly. And when someone acts abusively or tries to provoke you, they argue that person is often initiating a power struggle. Their goal isn't necessarily about the issue at hand, it's about winning, proving their power over you, like a child deliberately trying to wind up an adult.
And the danger is, if you react with your own anger.
You've taken the bait, you've entered their game on their terms. You're now locked in that power struggle. As the philosopher says, you've been taken in.
And what happens if someone feels they've lost that power struggle?
It can escalate. The next stage might be revenge.
Revenge. How does that play out?
The example of a child engaging in delinquent behavior. The typical explanation, the ideological one, might focus on past trauma, bad parenting causing the behavior.
Right. Cause and effect from the past.
But the teleological view asks, what is the child's goal right now? And the philosopher suggests the goal might actually be revenge against the parents. By misbehaving, getting into trouble, maybe even self-harming, the child forces the parents to worry, to panic, to suffer. The behavior serves the current purpose of retribution and control.
That's a really different lens to view that kind of behavior through. So if you want to avoid getting caught in these cycles, power struggle, leading potentially to revenge, what's the practical advice?
Step down. As soon as you recognize you're being challenged to a power struggle, disengage from it. Don't meet their provocation with an angry reaction.
But the young man raises a good point. How do you do that without just rolling over, without just grinning and bearing it, which still feels like being trapped in their game?
It's not about passive acceptance. The key, the philosopher argues, is learning to communicate without anger as your primary tool. Remember, you have language. You have logic.
Believe in the power of language and the language of logic.
Exactly. Anger is often a shortcut, a blunt instrument, but thoughtful communication, calm assertion, these are available, more constructive tools.
And one of the biggest obstacles to stepping down, they warn, is getting caught in the trap of thinking, I am right.
This is a huge warning sign. The quote is quite stark. The moment one is convinced that I am right in an interpersonal relationship, one has already stepped into a power struggle.
Wow, again, that feels quite absolute. Just believing you're right means you're fighting.
In the context of the relationship, yes, because thinking I am right almost inevitably leads to thinking, therefore, the other person is wrong. The focus immediately shifts from the actual substance of the issue to who wins and who loses the argument, who is superior in the interaction. It becomes about dominating the relationship, not finding truth.
And if you're stuck in that win-lose competitive mindset,
Then admitting you made a mistake, or that the other person has a point, feels like admitting defeat.
which stops you from actually correcting your course, even if you sense you might be wrong. You dig in your heels to avoid losing.
Exactly. So, admitting fault, apologizing sincerely, stepping away from provocation, these are not signs of defeat. They're signs of strength, maturity, and freedom from those destructive power dynamics.
It really does cloud your judgment when winning is the only goal.
Absolutely. You lose perspective. You can only start to see clearly and make genuine corrections when you take off those competitive goggles.
Okay, let's loop this all back to that very first bold claim. All problems are interpersonal relationship problems. How does the philosopher connect running away from these power struggles and competitions to that main idea?
The philosopher connected through the idea of avoiding Adler's life tasks. The argument is that many, if not all, of our psychological problems arise because we are trying to run away from facing these fundamental relational tasks.
Okay, so what are these life tasks? What does Adlerian psychology see as the goals of a healthy life?
There are objectives on two levels. Behaviorally, the goal is to be self-reliant and to live in harmony with society.
Self-reliance and social harmony.
And psychologically, the mindset needed to support that behavior is having a consciousness of your own ability, feeling capable, and crucially, having the consciousness that other people are your comrades.
Believing in yourself and seeing others as allies, not enemies. Got it.
And you achieve these goals, you live out these objectives by actively engaging with the life tasks. These are basically the inescapable interpersonal relationships you encounter just by living in a social world.
And they're categorized somehow.
Yes, by the degree of distance and depth involved in the relationship, sometimes called the three social ties.
Okay, what's the first task?
The tasks of work. This is generally seen as the lowest hurdle, the easiest task, because there's often a shared external objective getting the job done. You might have to cooperate even if you don't personally like someone.
Right.
But the philosopher points out, even here, avoidance isn't usually about the work itself. Someone avoiding work or struggling at work, it's often about avoiding the interpersonal fears. Fear of criticism, fear of being judged incompetent, fear of failure in the eyes of others. Think about the NEETs or shut-ins mentioned.
So the anxiety is still relational, even in a work context. Makes sense. What's the second task?
The tasks of friendship. This is harder because it's not mandatory like work often is. You have to actively choose to initiate and deepen these connections.
Yeah, it takes effort.
It's less about sheer numbers and more about the quality, the distance, and depth again. And this sphere really requires encouragement, giving and receiving it. The philosopher also notes something interesting. As you change, others have to change how they relate to you. Your courage impacts the relationship dynamic.
Okay, and the third task, the hardest one.
The tasks of love. This is seen as the most difficult and is split into two main types.
That's hard.
First, romantic love, marriage. This involves the closest distance and the deepest depth. True love, in this Adlerian view, isn't about possessing or restricting the other person that comes from distrust. It's about celebrating their happiness, even if it doesn't directly involve you. It's about freedom with the other person, being natural, relaxed, seeing each other as equal personalities.
And separation is possible if it's not working.
Yes, unlike the second type of love task, the parent-child relationship. That bond is described more like rigid chains compared to the red string of romance. You can't fundamentally just sever that connection. That inability to separate makes it uniquely challenging and complex.
So across all these tasks, work, friendship, love, the core messages.
You must not run away. Face the relationships, lean into them, even the difficult, distressing ones. Avoiding them, standing still, that's presented as the worst outcome.
And this act of running away, especially by defaulting to seeing others as competitors or enemies to justify the avoidance, this leads to what the philosopher calls the life lie.
Yes. It's a deliberately strong term. It refers to the habit of creating pretexts, excuses, justifications for avoiding your life tasks. Shifting the blame, basically.
Shifting responsibility onto others or your circumstances or your past.
Right. It works like this. First, you decide, maybe unconsciously, that you want to avoid a certain relationship or task. Then you start actively looking for flaws in the other person or reasons in your environment to justify that avoidance.
Like deciding you don't want to deal with Mr. A anymore and then suddenly noticing all his annoying habits as the reason.
Exactly. Or, in a relationship, one partner resolves, deep down, to end it. And then they start finding fault with absolutely everything the other person does. The partner likely hasn't changed much, the observer's goal has changed, so they seek justifications.
The philosopher is basically saying you can always find flaws if you look hard enough. The world can seem threatening and full of enemies if you choose that perspective.
Precisely because that perspective serves your goal of avoiding the tasks of connection and contribution.
It's called a life lie because it's such a fundamental deception, lying to yourself and maybe others to evade responsibility for your own life choices.
Yes, the message is blunt. You chose your lifestyle, you choose your interpretations. The power, and therefore the responsibility, lies with you.
And importantly, they frame this not in terms of good or evil or blame.
No, it's framed as an issue of courage. Lacking the courage to face life head-on. Avoiding tasks, relying on the life lie. It's seen not as moral failure, but as a deficit of courage.
Which brings us back to the core of Adlerian psychology. It's a psychology of courage.
And a psychology of use. It circles right back to that fundamental Adlerian principle we mentioned earlier.
It's not what one is born with, but what use one makes of that equipment.
Exactly. That's the direct contrast to more deterministic views, like Freudian etiology, that might see us as somewhat fragile products of our past traumas, defined by the equipment we were given or the damage we sustained.
Possession versus use.
Adlerian teleology, the psychology of use, emphasizes what we do with what we have right now. We choose our path, our lifestyle, and crucially, we have the power to change that choice.
Although the young man makes a fair point in the dialogue, just being told you need courage isn't always helpful. It's like telling someone their car's out of gas, but not where the gas station is.
Right. It requires more than just an instruction. It requires specific steps, a how-to, which admittedly weren't fully explored in this part of their conversation.
And the philosopher acknowledges that, right? Setting up the next big topic.
Precisely. They explicitly say that to really talk about gaining courage, you first need to understand freedom. That's the necessary foundation.
Wow. Okay. We have really covered a huge amount of ground, starting with that really provocative claim that all problems are interpersonal.
Then exploring subjective feelings, inferiority, the difference between a feeling and a complex.
Right. Then unpacking the idea that life isn't a competition, the dangers of power struggles, the importance of facing these life tasks.
And finally, landing on that very challenging concept of the life lie and the need for courage.
It's a lot to take in, and these ideas, they really push against a lot of conventional thinking about, well, why we struggle and who's in the driver's seat of our lives.
They absolutely do. They suggest a path towards a different way of experiencing the world and our relationships, but it clearly requires a conscious shift in perspective, a choice.
And underpinning that choice, that shift, is this recurring theme of courage. The courage to drop the excuses, to face relationships honestly, to choose a different interpretation.
So as we wrap up this exploration and look towards the next stage of this dialogue, here's that final thought for you, the listener, to consider. If facing life, facing others, facing ourselves requires courage, What exactly does freedom mean in this Adlerian context?
And how might understanding that freedom unlock the very courage needed to actually make these changes?
Something to definitely chew on.
Indeed.